Tear those goddamn survey pins out before he wakes up. Every single one!
Tessa Whitlock yelled at the man on the backhoe, jabbing one French-tipped fingernail at the orange flags that marked the southwest corner of my ranch. The bucket lunged. 40 surveyor stakes, each one I had paid $800 to set the day before, splintered into the Texas dust at 6 in the morning. I came around the cedar break with my coffee in one hand and my phone recording in the other. Tessa turned, smoothed her tennis skirt, and gave me a smile so polished it could have sold me a timeshare.
Mr. Holloway, you really need to stop being so dramatic about boundaries.
Behind her, the backhoe kept eating the pins. Behind me, my foreman was already on the phone with the Texas Rangers. She didn't know that the 100 wells under her HOA's golf course pulled their water from an aquifer that, on paper recorded yesterday afternoon, belonged to me. Drop your state in the comments. I want to know who's watching. My name is Wade Holloway. I'm 51 years old, and until yesterday afternoon, I owned 840 acres of West Comal County, Texas. As of the closing, my lawyer signed at 3:46 p.m. yesterday, I now own 1,042 of them. Every contiguous acre of the ranch my father, Marvin Holloway, lost to a corporate cattle conglomerate in 1989, and that I have been quietly buying back, one piece at a time, for the last 6 years. I served 12 years in the Marines, 2 tours. I was a long-range observer. I learned in those years to sit very still, watch the landscape for an entire day, and notice exactly which thing has changed since the last time I looked. After the Corps, I started a small cybersecurity firm in Austin, sold it in 2023 for considerably more than I had any business making, and used part of the money to start coming home. My wife, Cora, didn't get to come home with me. She passed in 2020, pancreatic. I won't say more than that, because some wounds don't get easier when you talk about them. Our son, Tate, is 22 now, in his second year at Texas A&M's veterinary school. He calls me on Sunday evenings. He says his grandfather Marvin would have liked the new herd I'm building. I think he's right. The land sits in the Texas Hill Country, half an hour northwest of San Antonio. Limestone outcrops, cedar breaks, oak mottes, and the slow brown ribbon of the Cibolo Creek running across the southern boundary. There are mesquite trees out there older than the state. There are ranch ruts older than the United States. The wind, in summer, smells like dry grass and warm rock. In winter, it smells like cedar smoke from 100 chimneys. My father's old work table still stood in the ranch office, its leather blotter cracked by sun and time. His pocket knife sat in the top drawer where he had left it, the day the bank took the title in 1989. I had cleaned that knife. I had sharpened it. I carried it in my front pocket every day. There were people in this county who would tell you the Holloway place had changed hands 4 times since Marvin lost it. Those people had not noticed that the man cleaning his shotgun on the porch every evening had the exact same name. Underneath all of that, 600 feet down, runs the Edwards Trinity Aquifer. It is the reason every living thing in this part of the hill country survives July. The closing on the final 200-acre parcel happened in San Antonio, at the offices of an old country lawyer named Saul Pemberton, who has handled 3 generations of Holloway land deals. Saul went over every document with the patience of a man who has watched too many people sign the wrong line. He underlined the well rights clause for me twice. "Wade," he said, "this is the most important page in this folder. The seller has expressly preserved every drop of groundwater under your land for the buyer. There is no severed estate. There is no recorded easement that pulls from this property. Whoever drinks Edwards Trinity water on these acres drinks it because you say so." I shook the seller's hand. Earl Calloway, a man in his late 70s, told me he was glad the land was going back to a Holloway. He said my father had once given him a colt for free during a hard year. He said he had never forgotten it. I drove home. I drank a beer on the porch with my foreman, Reuben Hatchett, watching the sun fall behind the limestone ridge. I went to bed at 9. I woke at 5:45 to the sound of a backhoe. The morning fog had not yet burned off the cedar break. The diesel engine grunted from the southwest corner of the property. I pulled on jeans, work boots, and a Marine Corps cap, grabbed my coffee mug and my phone, and walked out the gate without rushing. That was when I met Tessa Whitlock for the first time. And the next thing she said to me, after I caught her destroying my survey pins, was that I needed to stop being so dramatic about boundaries. That was the day she made her first mistake. It would not be her last. By 8 that morning, the backhoe had stopped. The surveyor I had paid was on his way back out for a restake at no extra charge, and Tessa Whitlock had introduced me to 2 other members of the Stone Hollow Ranch Estates Homeowners Association Board. A man named Lyle Foster, who wore a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered over the heart, and had the soft, satisfied face of a person who had never been told no, and a thin woman named Dottie Marsh, who carried a binder thick enough to break a cat's back. They stood at my gate as if I had invited them. "Mr. Holloway," Tessa said, "we wanted to give you a brief overview of community standards now that you've taken possession of the parcel adjacent to ours." "Adjacent to," I repeated. "I'm not in your community." "Oh, technically not," she said, and waved one hand the way some people wave away a fly. "But the board voted last spring that any property whose use impacts the visual coherence of Stone Hollow Ranch Estates is subject to compliance review." I put my coffee down on the gate post. Reuben, my foreman, was up by the barn pretending to oil a hinge while watching every move they made. He knew me well enough to know I was about to listen. Dottie opened her binder. The fines began at $3,400 and climbed from there. My barn, painted faded red, the way every barn in this county had been painted since before electricity, was deemed aesthetically inconsistent with the neighborhood palette. My equipment sheds, which contained equipment, were visually offensive. My cedar fence line was untidy. The old hand-stacked rock corner at the gate was unmaintained. My cattle were not aesthetically appropriate breeds. That last one stopped me for a full beat. "You want me to change the breed of my cattle," I said. "We'd prefer something cleaner looking," Dottie said. "Black Angus reads better than mottled stock." "That mottled stock is Texas Longhorn," I said. "It is the official state large mammal of Texas. It is on the seal of the Agriculture Department. You are asking a hill country rancher to change out Texas Longhorns for Black Angus, because Angus is, what, prettier?" She wrote something in her binder. Tessa cut in. "Mr. Holloway, we don't want to be adversarial. We just want to give you a chance to comply, voluntarily, before we begin enforcement." Enforcement. The HOA has retained counsel. I took a long, careful look at all 3 of them. The Texas sun was already starting to climb the cedar break. A mockingbird was running through its inventory of stolen songs in a live oak by the gate. "Mrs. Whitlock," I said, "you've already destroyed 40 survey pins this morning that I paid $800 apiece to install. Those pins were on my property. Your backhoe was on my property. Your authority, as far as I can tell, ends at your fence line, which is approximately 200 yards back that way. So before you tell me about enforcement, why don't we start with the $8,000 in survey damages, plus replacement, plus my time?" Lyle Foster cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway, the survey pins were placed in error. The boundary between our parcels is not entirely settled." "Settled by who?" "The board." I almost laughed. "Mr. Foster," I said, "a board vote does not move a property line. Closing documents at the county recorder do. I closed yesterday. The county has the deed. You don't get to vote it away." I leaned on the gatepost. I let the silence stretch. "I'd like you to leave my driveway, please. And I'd like you, by the end of this week, to mail my office a copy of the recorded easement that you believe gives your association the right to maintain the well field in my southwest pasture. Because if no such easement exists, we are going to have a very different conversation very soon." Dottie's pen stopped moving. Tessa's smile didn't crack, but I watched her eyes. The eyes are always slower than the smile. She blinked twice, looked at Lyle, looked back at me, and said brightly, "Of course, we'll be in touch." They left. That afternoon, Reuben rode the southwest fence line. He came back with his hat in his hand and a notebook of GPS pings. "Boss," he said, "the well field. Their well field. It's 86 yards inside our property line." I nodded. I had already known. That evening, an old man named Wendell Crockett drove up the ranch road in his '78 Ford pickup. He was 84, retired from the railroad, and had ridden cutting horses with my father in the 1970s. He climbed out slow, leaned his cane against the bumper, and walked to my porch with the quiet purpose of a man who'd seen everything at least once. "Wade," he said, "heard about the backhoe. You okay?" "I'm okay, Wendell." He squinted at me. "You remembering what your daddy used to say about a fight you don't pick?" "Win it slow," I said. He nodded once. "And bring receipts." He climbed back in his truck and drove off. He didn't say another word about it. But for the rest of the week, his old Ford parked in my driveway every morning at first light, just so anyone watching the highway would see he'd taken a side. 3 days later, a white pickup with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality logo on the door rolled up my driveway. The man who got out was in his 50s. He wore khakis, a TCEQ polo shirt, and a sun-bleached straw cowboy hat. His name was Hayden Mosley. He looked tired in the careful way of a man who had spent 20 years investigating complaints filed by people who didn't know what they were looking at. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "I've been asked to inspect a reported water pollution incident on the Cibolo Creek frontage of your ranch." Asked by who? He hesitated. Then, the way a tired man does, he just told me. "A Mrs. Whitlock of Stone Hollow Ranch Estates. The complaint alleges your cattle are defecating in the creek and you are not maintaining a buffer." I let out a breath through my nose. "Mr. Mosley, I'd like to walk you down to the creek myself." We took my UTV. He was quiet on the ride, the way state inspectors are quiet when they don't yet know what to make of you. The Cibolo at this stretch ran clean over limestone bottom, with cypress trees draping shade across the bend. I had built the riparian fence myself, 2 years before I closed on this final parcel, 60 feet back from the bank, all electrified, all maintained. The cattle drank from a piped trough on the far side. The buffer was thicker than the regulations required. He walked the bank for 40 minutes. He took photographs. He sampled the water at 3 points. He examined the fence line. He checked the manure load on the upland pasture, which Reuben kept rotated on a strict 3-week cycle. When he came back, he sat on the tailgate of the UTV and pulled off his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "this is one of the cleanest cattle operations on a hill country creek I have inspected this year. There is nothing here. I'll be marking the complaint as unfounded. I'll also be flagging it as a potential pattern of frivolous reporting." He paused. He looked at me with a long, careful kind of look. "Mr. Holloway," he said, off the record, "this is the 3rd complaint Mrs. Whitlock has filed against neighboring landowners in 18 months. The other 2 were against an organic vegetable farm and a goat dairy, both of whom turned out to be in better compliance than half the subdivisions I have to inspect. She has a habit of weaponizing this office. I just thought you should know." I thanked him. I shook his hand. I watched his pickup roll back down the driveway, raising a thin trail of caliche dust. That afternoon, I drove into Bernie and bought 8 cellular trail cameras, 2 sets of property pins with anti-tamper sleeves, a portable GPS surveyor unit, and a 400-page leather-bound notebook from the stationery store on Main Street. Reuben asked me what I was going to do. I said, "Document." He said, "How much?" I said, "Everything." That night, I sat on the porch with my second beer of the evening and called my son Tate in College Station. I told him the short version. He listened in the way he had inherited from his mother, which was to say, without interrupting. "Dad," he said when I was done, "is this going to be a long thing?" "Probably." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "Are they messing with the land?" "They are." He went quiet for a long second. Then he said, "Granddad would have hated her on sight." I told him that was already abundantly clear. He told me he was coming home for Memorial Day weekend. He told me to keep notes. I told him I had 8 cameras and a leather notebook ready to go. He laughed for the first time in our conversation. Then he said, "Make her sorry the slow way, Dad." I told him I would. After he hung up, I walked out to the barn. The longhorns were settled in the upper paddock, chewing in the slow evening rhythm cattle have when nothing is wrong. The stars were starting to come up over the limestone ridge. The hill country is a good place to think. I stood there for a long while with my hands on the top rail, working through what my next 20 steps were going to look like, and what order they needed to come in. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the Comal County Commissioner's Court. It informed me that a petition had been filed by Stone Hollow Ranch Estates Homeowners Association, requesting a determination of public necessity for the construction of a community access road across the southwest quarter of my newly acquired property. The proposed road would run, by remarkable coincidence, directly to the well field that the HOA had been operating without a recorded easement for approximately 22 years. The petition described the access road as a public benefit. It described the well field as a long-standing community water resource. It did not, of course, mention that the well field sat on land I had legally owned since the previous afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for 30 days out. I read the petition twice. I read it a third time. Then I called Saul Pemberton. Saul read me the petition over the phone in his dry, slow West Texas voice, with occasional pauses where he was, I assumed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. When he was done, he said one word: brazen. He told me to come to his office the next morning. He told me to bring every document from the closing folder, every utility plat I had access to, every copy of the original Holloway Ranch survey from 1958, and a quart of the dark roast he liked from the gas station off Main. I brought all of it. We spread the documents across his conference table. Saul read with a long-handled magnifying glass and a yellow legal pad. He muttered. He underlined. He drew arrows. He wrote, in a wandering Texas longhand, the words, "No recorded easement," in block letters across one page, and circled them 3 times. After 2 hours, he leaned back, took off his reading glasses, and looked at me over the top of them. "Wade," he said, "this petition is a stalling tactic. They know what's coming. They are trying to manufacture a public benefit narrative before the easement question becomes the headline. They have not produced any deed. They will not, because no deed exists. The well field was a handshake between Earl Calloway and the original developer of Stone Hollow back in 2003. Earl let them sink the wells because Earl was a friendly man, and they put it on a back corner he wasn't using. He never granted them a recorded easement. The seller's title work last month flagged that, which is why the closing documents specifically reaffirm your unencumbered groundwater estate." He set the magnifying glass down. He folded his hands. "Wade, they are pumping water from your land. They have been pumping water from your land for 2 decades. They have, in the eyes of Texas law, no right to do so. And under the Texas rule of capture, every gallon they have ever pumped you may legally claim, now or in the future." I sat very still in his office, with my hat on my knee, and let that sentence settle into me for a long minute. I asked him what we should do. He said, "We let them keep showing their hand. We don't tell them yet what we know. We file a quiet appearance at the eminent domain hearing. We let them argue public necessity, and then we bring the deed." I asked him about the timing. He said, "You are about to learn, Wade Holloway, that patience is the most Texan virtue there is." I drove home that afternoon in a slow, deliberate kind of silence. The hill country flickered past the truck windows in late spring colors. Bluebonnets were already gone. Indian paintbrush was just starting. The cattle stood under the live oak shade. Reuben was waiting at the gate. He had a fresh GPS pin reading in his pocket. He had a list of 3 things the HOA's groundskeepers had done that morning along the east fence line. I told him to write them down. I told him we were not in a hurry. I told him the next move was theirs. He grinned, the way a man grins when he knows the wind has just changed, and he can feel it on his face. He said, "Yes, sir, boss. Let them keep digging." 2 days later, the HOA's groundskeepers strung a temporary chain across the access road they had been using to service the well field. They put a "Private, Stone Hollow Residents Only" sign at the chain. The chain crossed my property at 3 places. I drove out to it with Reuben. We took photographs. We took GPS coordinates. We did not move the chain. We did not cut it. We let it stand. The chain was an admission. Saul, when I called him that evening, laughed for the 2nd time in 20 years. A week after my meeting with Saul, a tall woman in dusty hiking boots and a wide straw hat stepped out of an SUV at the end of my driveway. Her name was Dr. Rosalind Forsyth. She held a doctorate in hydrogeology from the University of Texas, had spent 26 years studying the Edwards Trinity Aquifer, and had been recommended to Saul by a federal water judge in Austin who owed him a favor. She walked the property for 2 days. She drilled 3 test bores with a small portable rig. She mapped fractures in the limestone outcrops. She used a thermal camera at dusk to read groundwater stress in the live oaks. On the 3rd morning, she sat at my kitchen table over coffee and laid 4 maps across the surface. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "this is the recharge zone for the cluster of wells operated by Stone Hollow Ranch Estates. It enters the aquifer through a band of fractured limestone running diagonally across your southwest pasture and your central oak motte. Roughly 70% of the water Stone Hollow pumps annually originates as rainfall on your land." She tapped the 2nd map. "This is the cone of depression. It is the bowl-shaped drawdown the HOA's well field creates underground when it pumps. Their cone of depression extends 2,000 feet into your property in every direction. They are not pulling water from beneath their own land. They are pulling water from beneath yours." She tapped the 3rd map. "This is the modeling I ran for current drought conditions. Stone Hollow's 12-acre amenity lake currently holds 18 million gallons. They lose 300,000 gallons a day to evaporation, leakage, and irrigation. They replace that loss continuously with water pumped from your aquifer. If those pumps stop, the lake dries to mud in 28 days. She tapped the 4th. "This is the regional water market valuation for severable groundwater rights of this volume. At current Texas pricing, the rights you closed on yesterday afternoon are worth somewhere between $42 and $68 million. I drank my coffee. The cicadas started up in the live oak by the kitchen window. She closed her folio. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I am going to be very straightforward. The HOA has been pumping water for 22 years that does not belong to them, from a well field they built on land that does not belong to them, under an easement that was never recorded. You can legally shut their pumps off tomorrow morning. With drought conditions, their entire amenity infrastructure collapses inside a month." She paused. "The question, Mr. Holloway, is not whether you can. The question is when and how publicly." That afternoon, I drove out to see Earl Calloway in his retirement place outside Bandera. He was 79, weathered, sharp as a glass shard. He sat in a cane chair on his porch and listened to the whole story without interrupting. When I was done, he sighed long. "Wade," he said, "I let those folks put their wells on that corner because the developer brought me a 6-pack and a smile. There was never a paper. There was never a recording. I did your daddy a disservice not getting it cleaned up before I sold. I'm going to fix that now." He had me drive him to a notary in town. He signed an affidavit for Saul. The handshake was, for the record, finally unmade. Before I left his porch, Earl walked me to my truck. He pulled an old leather wallet from his back pocket, took out a tarnished silver dollar, and pressed it into my palm. "Your father gave me this in '78, he said. When I asked what it was for, he said it was for the next time I needed to remember a Holloway. Reckon it ought to come back home now." I closed my fist around it. I put it in my own pocket. I have not taken it out since. I drove home with that affidavit in a leather folder on the passenger seat, watching the late sun go gold across the hill country, knowing for the first time exactly what I owned and exactly how much. Saul and I built the case the way you build a stock tank, slow, deliberate, with every piece in the right order and every drainage angle calculated. The first thing we did was get the official survey re-stamped and re-recorded with the county. Bo Vickers, the surveyor I had hired the first time, came back out with 2 crews and reset every pin. He used anti-tamper sleeves this time, with embedded iron rebar, and he photographed each one with GPS coordinates and timestamps. He charged me at his cost. He told me he had been wanting to put eyes on the well field boundary for years. The well field, when we mapped it, sat 86 yards inside my property line. Not arguably inside, not maybe inside, 86 measured yards. The second thing we did was retain Dr. Forsyth on a permanent advisory contract and contract her firm to do a full Texas Water Code Section 36 hydrogeological report, suitable for filing with both the county and the Regional Groundwater Conservation District. The third thing was register myself as a permitted producer with the GWCD. The district officer, a man named Hank Garrett, met me in his small Bernie office and walked me through the paperwork himself. He was 55, lean, with the patient eyes of a man who had spent his career adjudicating fights between people who all wanted more water than the rocks under them held. When I told him about the Stone Hollow situation, he leaned back, took off his reading glasses, and let out a low whistle. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "I have been wondering for 10 years when somebody was going to flag those wells. The HOA's annual production reports never quite added up to their easement claims. Their easement claims were never on file with us. We assumed it was a paperwork issue." "It is not a paperwork issue," I said. "No, sir, it is not." Within a week, my permits were in. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Forsyth's report was filed with the county. Within 3 weeks, Saul had drafted, but not yet served, 3 documents: a notice of trespass, a demand for accounting of all water pumped from the unauthorized well field since 2003, and an injunction motion to enjoin further pumping. We held all 3. Meanwhile, I quietly upgraded the operational side. I had Reuben and a contracted crew run new electric fence along the entire shared boundary, with reinforced gates, lighted entry points, and mounted trail cameras at every corner. We installed 8 more cellular trail cams along the well field perimeter, hidden in cedar breaks and live oak crowns, all motion triggered, all night vision, all time-stamped, all uploading to a cloud account Saul could access. I bought a small, remote-monitored generator in case the HOA tried something cute with my electrical service. I had Reuben's cousin, an HVAC contractor in San Antonio, install discrete hardwired sensors on the well field's external pump housings to detect any tampering or shutdown attempts. I also asked Saul to walk me through every legal weapon I might need within 48 hours' notice. He drafted, in advance, a temporary restraining order, an emergency well shutoff request, and a criminal trespass complaint, all in their final form, all signed and dated, all ready to file the moment we needed them. He kept the originals in his vault. He kept copies in mine. The way Saul put it, you don't want to be drafting a fire response when the barn is already lit. I did not tell anyone outside Saul, Reuben, Dr. Forsyth, Hank Garrett, and my son what I was building. I let Tessa Whitlock keep believing the eminent domain petition was the main fight. She kept showing her hand, the way Saul had said she would. She filed 2 more aesthetic violation letters. She filed a public statement on the HOA's social media about the difficult holdout on their boundary. She organized a Save the Stone Hollow Lake campaign that complained about my ranch creating water stress, when in fact, every drop of stress they were experiencing came from their own well field pulling from my land. I documented every post. I screenshotted every comment. I forwarded every threat that came into my email or my mailbox. Tate came home the 3rd week of May, the way he had promised. He helped Reuben reset fence. He drove the UTV alongside me on long inspection rides. On the last evening of the long weekend, he stood with me at the southwest corner of the property, looking at the well field in the deepening dusk, and said, very quietly, "Dad, they have no idea, do they?" I told him no. They had no idea at all. He grinned, the way his mother used to grin, and said, "Granddad would have loved this." In early June, Tessa Whitlock made her largest public push. She hired a lobbyist out of Austin, a smooth, fast-talking man named Trent Maddox, who specialized in HOA advocacy and who had previously worked for 2 state representatives. Trent immediately filed an amended petition with the county, expanding the eminent domain request to include not just the access road, but a compatible buffer zone, covering the entire southern strip of my ranch, about 140 acres of cedar brake, live oak savanna, and creek bottom. He framed it as a community resilience corridor. Tessa, in parallel, launched a region-wide media campaign. The Stone Hollow HOA paid for a full-page ad in the San Antonio Express News, describing me as an absentee outsider neglecting historic ranch land. She gave an interview to a local cable station in which she claimed my cattle were destroying the watershed. She organized a Saturday morning rally outside the gates of Stone Hollow with handmade signs reading, "Save our lake." She did not, of course, mention that the lake was filled with my water. Reuben told me about the rally first. He had driven past it in his pickup on his way to the feed store. He had counted 28 people, two of whom had been holding the signs upside down. I went into Bernie that afternoon and met Sloan Bracewell, the senior reporter at the Regional Hill Country Herald. Sloan was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, the kind of journalist who had stayed in regional reporting because she actually cared about it. She had grown up on a ranch outside Comfort. She knew water rights better than most lawyers. I gave her nothing on the record yet. I gave her, off the record, the survey data, the GWCD filings, the affidavit from Earl Calloway, and the photographs of the well field's actual location relative to the property line. I told her the public hearing was in 3 weeks. I told her she would want to be there. She studied the documents for 10 minutes. She looked up at me with eyes that had gone slowly, quietly bright. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "when you decide to publish, you call me first." I told her I would. The next day, the HOA's lobbyist filed a request with Comal County to conduct a preliminary blight assessment of my ranch. The assessment, if approved, could legally pave the way for a county-led condemnation if the property was found to be in persistent neglect. I drove to my barn that morning, looked at the freshly painted trim, the new cedar gate I had just hung, the rotational paddock layout, the cattle grazing in clean lines, and I laughed out loud for the first time in 2 months. That afternoon, my mailbox carried 4 envelopes. None had a return address. Inside each was a handwritten note from a Stone Hollow resident, anonymous, apologetic, telling me the truth about what was happening on the inside of the HOA. One letter mentioned that the board had quietly increased dues by $800 per home to fund the eminent domain effort. Another mentioned that Tessa had been seen in heated arguments with 2 contractors at the well field. A third said that several Stone Hollow residents had contacted the local water authority to complain about brown tap water in their kitchens, but the HOA had told them to keep it quiet. A fourth letter, longer than the others, came from a retired school teacher on the eastern edge of Stone Hollow. She wrote that she had moved into the subdivision in 2005 with her late husband, that she had ridden the old ranch roads as a girl, back when the Calloway family had still owned the land, and that she had cried the first time she saw the survey pin damage from her morning walk. She included a photograph of an old hand-drawn map her grandfather had made of the area in the 1940s, showing the well field site clearly inside what the map labeled, in faded pencil, Holloway North Pasture. I sat on the porch a long time with her photograph. I tucked each letter into the leather notebook. I underlined the line about the brown tap water. I forwarded a copy to Dr. Forsyth. Within 36 hours, she emailed back. Aquifer drawdown is reaching the limestone fracture zone. They are pulling sediment. They have at most 14 days before turbidity becomes a public health issue. I read her email twice on the porch in the cool of the evening. I picked up the phone. I called Saul. "It's time," I said. He said, "I'll have the papers on your desk by Monday morning." On the night of June 14th, my phone buzzed at 1:47 a.m. It was a motion alert from the trail camera mounted in the live oak, 40 feet east of the southernmost well housing. I sat up in bed. The hill country was at full summer dark. No moon, only stars. The bullfrogs had quieted in the stock tank. Somewhere out across the cedar break, a screech owl called once and stopped. I opened the camera app. 3 figures in black hoodies and headlamps were crouched at the base of the well housing. One was working a pry bar at the access panel. Another was holding a flashlight. The third stood with arms folded, watching the perimeter. I checked the secondary camera on the maintenance shed. 2 more figures were crouched at the electrical junction box, working a pair of wire cutters. I called Sheriff Cole Drennan first. Sheriff Drennan was 63, square-jawed, had grown up in Comal County, and had once played high school football against my father. He picked up on the second ring, his voice already alert. "Wade. Cole, I have 5 unidentified persons on my southwestern well field, attempting to tamper with both the well housings and the electrical infrastructure. 1:47 a.m. They are physically on my property. I have them on multiple cameras." "Stay inside," he said. "I'll have a unit there in 12 minutes. I'm sending 2. I stayed inside. I watched on my phone. The trio at the well housing got the access panel open. They were photographing the interior. The crouching figure laughed, low. The flashlight figure said something about hurrying. The third figure, the one standing, kept glancing at her watch. I zoomed in. The watch was a Cartier. The wrist was small, French manicured, distinctly female, and unmistakable. Tessa. The wire cutter pair at the junction box snipped through the secondary breaker line. The lights on the maintenance shed went dark. They did not, however, know about the redundant circuit Ruben's cousin had installed. The cameras kept recording on backup power. 12 minutes later, 2 cruisers came down the ranch road from the highway, cutting their lights at the cattle gate the way Sheriff Drennan had taught his deputies to do. They pulled wide on either side of the well field. They closed the trio in from 2 angles. The footage on my phone showed 5 figures freezing and 5 flashlight beams, hands going up, the pry bar dropping into the dust, the wire cutters dropping. Tessa's voice, suddenly small and scratchy, asking if she could please call her attorney. By 3 a.m., she was in handcuffs. The 4 men with her, 2 Stone Hollow groundskeepers, the HOA treasurer's adult son, and a private security contractor she'd paid in cash, were in handcuffs beside her. Sheriff Drennan came up to my porch where I was waiting with coffee. He took the mug. He took a long, slow look at the eastern horizon, where the first thin line of dawn was thinking about coming up. "Wade," he said, "she's been caught at 1:47 in the morning, on your land, attempting to physically sabotage water infrastructure that is now under active state regulatory review, with 4 hired men. Do you have any idea how many felonies that just stacked?" I said I had a guess. He said, "You have no idea." Off the record, in the cruiser on the way to county lockup, Tessa apparently tried to invoke her husband's name 3 times, each louder than the last. The deputy did not respond. Then she went silent for 15 minutes. Then, just before the booking station, she asked, very small, what was going to happen to her tennis club membership. Cole told me later he had to roll the front window down to keep from laughing in the rear view. The next morning, the Hill Country Herald ran Sloan Bracewell's first article. Front page, above the fold. The headline read, HOA president arrested at 1:47 a.m. Tampering with wells she claimed in court belonged to her community. By noon, the Express News had picked it up. By evening, the Austin American-Statesman had it on the wire. By the next morning, the Texas Tribune had a senior reporter on her way to Bernie. Trent Maddox, the lobbyist, dropped his retainer with the HOA the same afternoon. The eminent domain hearing was 4 days away. Tate called me on Sunday. He said, "Dad, is it almost over?" I told him no. The loud part was just starting. The Comal County Commissioner's Court Chamber is a long, paneled room in a 1970 brick courthouse with too much air conditioning and a small Texas flag on the dais. On the morning of June 18th, the chamber was packed. The Stone Hollow Ranch Estates, HOA, sent its remaining board, minus Tessa Whitlock, who was at her arraignment in a different building. Lyle Foster sat at the petitioner's table beside a new attorney, a man named Garland Ridley out of Austin, whose suit cost more than my first truck. Dottie Marsh sat behind them, no binder this time. Saul Pemberton sat at my table with a single leather folder and a yellow legal pad. Beside us sat Dr. Rosalind Forsyth. Beside her, Hank Garrett of the Groundwater Conservation District. Beside him, Earl Calloway in his Sunday boots and a string tie. Beside Earl, Surveyor Bo Vickers. Behind us, Sloan Bracewell with 2 photographers. Behind her, half the cable news crews in the Hill Country. 3 rows back, in his dress uniform, sat Lieutenant Cyrus Beauchamp of Texas Ranger Company F. He was tall, calm, and present in the way Texas Rangers are present. The presiding commissioner, Judge Marlene Hadley, called the room to order. The HOA's new attorney, Mr. Ridley, stood and presented the petition. He spoke for 14 minutes about community necessity, water resilience, and historical access. He never once produced a deed. When he finished, Judge Hadley turned to our table. Saul stood. He cleared his throat once. He laid the leather folder open on the table. "Your Honor," he said, "before we address public necessity, the petitioner has made several factual claims about a deeded easement and a long-standing community water resource. Counsel, would you produce the recorded easement?" Mr. Ridley hesitated for a long, telling second. "Your Honor, the easement is, long-standing by practice rather than recording. It is a customary access. Saul let that hang for a beat. Then he held up a single sheet of paper. This, he said, is the closing deed for the southwest parcel, recorded with Comal County, dated April 30th of this year. It expressly preserves all groundwater rights to the buyer. There is no easement on record. There has never been one. He held up a second sheet. This is an affidavit signed by Mr. Earl Calloway, the previous owner, attesting that no easement was ever recorded, granted, or paid for, and that the well field was a verbal courtesy that ended its sale. He held up a third sheet. This is the survey report by Bo Vickers, certified in May, establishing that the Stone Hollow well field sits 86 measured yards inside Mr. Holloway's recorded property line. He held up a fourth. This is Dr. Rosalind Forsyth's hydrogeological report, filed last week with this county and the Groundwater Conservation District. It establishes that the cone of depression from the Stone Hollow wells extends 2,000 feet into Mr. Holloway's property, that 70% of the water Stone Hollow pumps annually originates as recharge on Mr. Holloway's land, and that, under current drought conditions, Stone Hollow's amenity lake will dry to mud in 28 days if pumping is enjoined. The chamber did not breathe. Saul held up a fifth. This is footage, recorded at 1:47 a.m. on June 14th, of Mrs. Tessa Whitlock and 4 hired men on Mr. Holloway's land, attempting to sabotage the well field in question. Mrs. Whitlock is currently being arraigned on 5 felony counts. He held up a sixth and final sheet. This, he said, is the notice of trespass and demand for accounting that we are filing with this court today, seeking damages for 22 years of unauthorized groundwater extraction at current Texas water market rates. He laid all 6 sheets on the table. Behind us in the gallery, 11 Stone Hollow residents stood up. They had not coordinated. They simply rose, one after another, in a slow ripple that moved from the back row to the third row. None of them spoke. They simply stood, facing the petitioner's table, while the courtroom waited. Earl Calloway, white-haired, ramrod straight, stood with them. Wendell Crockett rose from his seat in his Sunday hat. The HOA's attorney glanced over his shoulder once. He glanced again. He did not look back a third time. Mr. Ridley sat down without speaking. Lieutenant Beauchamp stood up and walked to the front. He did not say much. He didn't need to. He simply identified himself, identified the active criminal investigation, and informed the court that the Texas Rangers would be filing additional charges within the week. Judge Hadley looked at the petitioner's table for a long moment. She looked at Lyle Foster. "Mr. Foster," she said, "the petition is denied. You may take your community resilience corridor and your customary access easement and walk them out of this courthouse before the bailiffs walk you." The gavel came down. I felt Reuben's hand grip my shoulder. Tate, sitting in the second row in his Texas A&M cap, broke into a slow, wide grin that looked exactly like his mother's. The civil settlement came 11 months later. The Stone Hollow Ranch Estates Homeowners Association was dissolved by court order. Its remaining assets were placed in receivership and used to pay back 22 years of unauthorized water extraction at current Texas water market rates. Tessa Whitlock pleaded guilty to felony trespass on a regulated water resource, felony tampering with critical infrastructure, and felony conspiracy. She served 16 months in state custody, paid a 6-figure fine, and was permanently barred from sitting on any homeowner's board in the state of Texas. Her husband paid restitution and divorced her quietly. Lyle Foster cooperated, paid a smaller fine, and resigned from real estate. The 4 men arrested at the well field each served sentences ranging from 60 days to 14 months, and gave sworn statements that named names. The total damages awarded came to $26.4 million. I did not keep most of it. I worked with Saul, Dr. Forsyth, Hank Garrett, and Earl Calloway to put $21 million of those dollars into a thing we called the Hill Country Water Trust. The trust paid for the formal restoration of the recharge zone on my southwest pasture, the protective conservation easement of the Cedar Break and Oak Motte, and the fencing of the riparian corridor along the Cibolo Creek. It paid for an interpretive trail, open to the public on the second Saturday of every month. that walked visitors through the geology, the history, and the simple, stubborn fact that water in Texas runs through the rocks the way truth runs through the law, slow, sure, and uninterested in opinion. It paid for an annual scholarship in my father's name, the Marvin Holloway Hill Country Ranching Award, given each year to a Texas student pursuing veterinary medicine or sustainable ranching. The first recipient, announced on the trust's first anniversary, was a young woman from Uvalde whose family had lost their land in the same 1989 wave that had taken my father's. I drove down with Tate to deliver the check in person. The Interpretive Trail's first public Saturday drew over 200 visitors. School buses came in from 3 counties. Tate drove down for it. He stood at the southwest gate in his A&M cap, talking to a group of 4th graders about the way limestone holds and releases water, the way the recharge zone works, the way his grandfather Marvin had run cattle on this land before he was born. One of the boys asked him if it was cool to be a future veterinarian. Tate said yes. The boy told him he wanted to be a future veterinarian too. Tate gave him a Texas A&M sticker out of his back pocket. The boy walked away looking at it like it was made of gold. The 220 residents of the former Stone Hollow Ranch estates negotiated, individually, a metered water lease with my ranch at fair market rates. They paid less, on average, than they had been paying the HOA in dues. Their tap water cleared up inside 3 weeks. Their lake filled back to its summer line. Several of them, including Loretta Pace, who had been one of the anonymous letter writers, sent me handwritten thank you cards and apologies for things they had not personally done. I framed 2 of those letters. Tessa Whitlock's family, by separate negotiation, pays triple. There are some lessons that need to be paid in monthly installments to be properly learned. Tate is back at A&M, on track to graduate top of his class. He tells me his grandfather Marvin would have liked the new herd, and the new fence, and the new trail. I have learned a few things from all of this. I'd like to share them, if you'll let me. The first is that paper is patient. The deed I closed on at 3:46 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon outranked 22 years of HOA assumption by the time the sun came up the next morning. If you've got land, read your deed. Read your survey. Read the easements. Read the page nobody told you was important. The page nobody told you was important is always the important page. The second is that water finds its level, and so does justice. You cannot bully a watershed. You cannot vote a property line. You cannot post your way to a recharge zone. You can only, eventually, meet the rock. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA with a clipboard and a logo, drop your story in the comments. Tell me your county. Tell me your state. Tell me the moment you finally said no. I read every one. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's a story coming up next about a retired airline pilot in Montana whose HOA tried to ban him from landing his own plane on his own grass strip, and forgot to check who held the original FAA airfield designation. You don't want to miss what he had registered with the federal government. But that's a story for next time. Tonight, I'm going to walk the Cibolo at dusk. I'm going to listen to the cicadas in the live oaks. I'm going to thank my father, Marvin Holloway, one more time for teaching me to sit very still and watch the landscape until the thing that has changed shows itself. It always does.
There's something I want you to take from this story before you click away. Tessa Whitlock didn't fall because Texas law was harsh. She fell because she was confident in things she never bothered to check. She never read the deed. She never called the groundwater conservation district. She never looked up the easement. She assumed her HOA's 22 years, then handshake outlining a piece of paper which had signed at 3:46 on a Tuesday afternoon. Greg's real advantage was never anger. It was patience. A leather notebook, 8 trail cameras, an old neighbor's outfit, and a hydrogeologist who knew how to read the limestone. Underneath all of it was Texas Truth paper, slow, certain, uninterested in opinion. Communities are not built by the loudest voice at the HOA meeting. They are built by people who walk their fence line, read their deeds, and teach their children to do the same. If a story like this has hit your county, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Hit subscribe. There's a retired airline pilot in Montana you will want to meet.